Okay, so let's get this ball rolling with our first panel, which we're calling How It's Done, Behind the Scenes of Three Great Stories, where we'll hear the backstory of some truly excellent investigations from the past year. To moderate this panel, we are so lucky to have Azmat Khan here with us, who will step in for, where's Azmat? Is Azmat? I hope she's here with us. We got problems if she's not. Who's going to be stepping in for Sarah Childress, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it here today. Azmat is, as I'm sure you all know, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter whose work grapples with the human costs of war. She is an investigative reporter for both the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. She's a Carnegie Fellow and the Birch Assistant Professor at Columbia Journalism School, where she also leads the Lee Center for Global Journalism. Azmat is writing a book for Random House that investigates America's air wars, and I hope you all remember her from last year when she was actually a panelist on this panel and told us about how she pulled off that remarkable investigation into drone strikes in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're gonna go find her. Oh, I see her right out there right now. She looks like she's running away. Azmat? Come join us. It's time for you to moderate. Come here. Is there one missing?
I think so.
Oh, there is one, yeah. So there's one speaker who took, I think, 4 flights last night to get here, who's racing. Oh, there she is. Anna Wolfe, you get the prize for the greatest effort of all. Anna, how many flights were you on? 5 airports? How much sleep did you get? No? Okay, thank you so much for making the effort to be here. And Azmat will now introduce the speakers and we'll get going.
Well, I'm so excited to be here at the Logan Symposium, and I'm especially excited for us to be having this conversation with 3 journalists that I admire so much. I want to introduce each of them and give you a brief sketch of the work that they've done. I'll start with Mukhtar Ibrahim, who is a digital media entrepreneur and journalist. He's the founder, publisher, and CEO of Sahan Journal, a local nonprofit digital news organization dedicated to covering Minnesota's immigrants and communities of color. He's won a slew of awards, most recently an award from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press as a rising leader in local news. And he'll be talking today about an investigation and a series of stories that exposed fraud and abuse and alleged mismanagement of money that was meant to feed people in Minnesota. Please welcome Mukhtar Ibrahim. Is he the one who isn't here yet? Oh, okay, great. Good to know. So just to give you a little bit of transparency here, I think I left my laptop in the Uber on the way here, so I'm a little out of sorts, but we will carry on. Okay. Which had all of my notes.
Hi. I just came from
We're also joined today by Hamza Syed, the co-host of the New York Times and serial productions podcast, The Trojan Horse Affair, which, if any of you have listened to, you'll know is radically transformative in podcasting and takes transparency to a whole new level. It's a look at a very dodgy letter that circulated in Birmingham, which is where Hamza is from in the United Kingdom, and upended an educational system. And Hamza set out to ask the one thing that no one had really done, which is who wrote this and why, and to explore the devastating effects that it had on his community. We're also joined by, just a second, Anna Wolfe. an investigative reporter for Mississippi Today, a nonprofit newsroom founded in 2016. Her coverage of poverty, public assistance, and debtors' prisons has received national recognition, including the Goldsmiths Prize and many other awards. She'll be talking today about a series of stories that she did investigating welfare fraud in that state, and how money that was meant for some of the most poor there went to, well, she'll tell you, and you'll find out exactly where that money went. So let's please welcome these two speakers and Mukhtar, who'll be joining us shortly. So I'm going to start with you, Hamza. Can you tell us a little bit about how this story came about and why you needed to pursue it? Sometimes the hardest thing in finding an investigation, even when it's right in front of you, is really finding that initial thread and understanding you have something there. What was it for you?
You can hear me, right? I was applying to journalism school, and you had to come along with a story to investigate as part of your master's. So I was like, I need a fucking find story. Now, this had happened in my city in 2014, this whole hoopla around the Trojan horse, this mysterious letter that turned up and turned everything upside down. And it had largely then gone quiet in terms of the mainstream press in the years that followed. I'd been tracking it because I actually have a bit of a convoluted history. I used to be a doctor, and I left medicine to be a comedy writer. I was funny once. And then, as I was doing the comedy thing at the BBC, you get a bit older, you get a bit less like self-centered. Some of you can look forward to that in years to come. And you start worrying a bit, at least I did, about how little you're contributing to anyone around you except for your own benefit. And having come from a medical background, that was even more embarrassing for me. So journalism kind of came through just the guilt of wanting to do something, but like really enjoying writing. And so I applied for this master's course. I'd been tracking the Trojan horse because I was actually working on a terrorist drama for the BBC once. And part of that involved just researching the stuff that's being reported. How do you, mate? Give him an applause again.
I'm here.
I was just talking about why I did this story or how it came about. Okay, so anyways, I was doing some research for a terrorist drama, and it became clear to me when I was doing the research for a project how important journalism is in the process of radicalization. It's one of the initial triggers. And so I was tracking the news for research purposes to begin with, because no offense to anyone in this room, but like I don't like journalists and I don't like journalism. So I just couldn't be bothered to actually like follow the news for my own mental health. I was just doing it for work purposes. And that's when the Trojan horse happened. And it was so ridiculous to me, almost immediately, how everyone was approaching that story, that I was just like tracking it, both personally, just out of my own kind of like worries for what's happening in Britain, also because I had this kind of desire maybe to explore journalism at some point. So I always had this story as a thing I would come back to. And so what happened was there was a bunch of court cases that had come as part of that process, which all collapsed in like this ridiculous, spectacular way one summer. And so I applied for journalism school, and I said I was going to investigate this like a few months later. And I was laughed at the room, as you are in most places in Britain, when you say you want to do the Trojan horse story, because everyone has looked at this and everyone's come to a consensus. So
can you tell them a little bit about what you were reading about the Trojan horse affair?
So the allegation was, or at least the official narrative is, that there was a conspiracy amongst a bunch of Muslim educators, teachers and school governors and others, to take over schools in this particular part of Birmingham, which is almost entirely Muslim, East Birmingham. And with the aim of ... because it was never clear. This letter that was found that kind of triggered the authorities to this plot was missing pages. So the first page was missing, you didn't know who wrote it or where it came from. The last page was missing, so you literally had no idea where it was headed. But the 4 pages that were intercepted were all kind of like photocopied in a rush as if it had been found by someone. And what it spelled out was, we have a plot called Operation Trojan Horse. It's masterminded by this educator named Tahir Alam. And we are taking over schools with the aim of, I don't know, you can assume, but like the idea is this is a jihad, that word is mentioned, and you can imagine where this is supposed to go. So this turned up at the local government in Birmingham. They freaked out for a couple of months, but privately. This letter started being sent around to other people. Initially, it made its way to the national government, who freaked out, but publicly. And that's how I woke up to it. Like, March, I stick the news on, and like I said, I was a comedy writer, so I had no purpose to be involved in any of this stuff. So I'm just a civilian. I wake up and it's breaking news: terrorists are taking over schools, jihadis, blah blah blah, etc., etc., etc. The former head of counter-terrorism of Britain turns up to investigate the situation. 4 national inquiries are launched simultaneously. Every reporter, whether it's newspaper or broadcast news, turns up to Birmingham. And are just chasing brown kids around the street saying, "Are you a radical?" basically, for several months. Then official reports start coming in from all the investigations that were launched, and it was just a sequence of big words, to be honest, charts, and if you're into that kind of stuff, but no evidence, as far as what I understand evidence to be. It was just bereft of any facts, and yet it was enough to warrant some really serious changes in Britain. Like the educators who were implicated in the schools that they worked at, they were commandeered by the government, and those educators were given lifetime bans from ever working in schools again. Our counter-extremism law was changed to accommodate for the Trojan horse, and the government mandated that every public sector worker, so that's teachers, doctors, university lecturers, they essentially have to spy on their colleagues and their students on behalf of the state because of the Trojan horse. Our education law was changed, and something called British values was introduced to curriculum. And I don't know what British values are. I've been through the education system in Britain. I still don't know what they are. They seem very, very broad, like decency and generosity, and I don't know why that's uniquely British, but that's our British values. So, I'm watching all these very, very big things happen, and yet, remarkably, the entire episode just seemed to be missing facts, to speak to your title here. Nobody seemed to care about that, or even evidence. The insinuation was enough for all of Britain to basically agree that these guys were baddies, and these schools are doing terrible things, and we need to change a lot to make sure nothing like this happens. So that's, when I came in, I was just trying to find some truth to what happened. And for me, the instigating document, that letter, nobody embarked on any serious investigation to figure out where that came from. Quite frankly, nobody even looked at the content of it, because it was that shoddy that you only have to give it a read once for you to not only have a very clear idea that this is bollocks, but also who might be responsible for it. And so that's kind of how I came into it. I applied to journalism school. I said I was going to look at the Trojan horse. They said, "Don't bother." I said...
what did your professor say when you pitched this idea?
He told me, "Mate, stop fucking around. You've got a few weeks. You've got a few weeks to submit something serious. This ain't gonna be nothing." And I wasn't even. Listen, he's a good guy. I make him sound like a clown, but he's really decent dude. But he came from British media circles, you know what I mean? And so this was the response wherever you went, whether it's Guardian, BBC, you name it. There's not one outlet that was taking this seriously. And I got lucky. There was an American podcast host called Brian Reed who was passing through Birmingham, my city. He just put out this podcast called S-Town, which was doing really, really well. And I like their stories. I'd only listened to 2 podcasts actually in my life before I met Brian. That was Serial Season 1 and S-Town. So I decided, he was speaking in a hall not too different to this, and I decided I was going to sneak backstage when he was done and basically just ambush him and say, "Mate, there's a fucking thing here. Nobody's taking me seriously. Can I run it by you? You're American. Maybe you kind of come at it with a fresh mind."
It's a great tip, by the way. If you want to accost anyone backstage, just follow his
Yeah. Just speak really quickly and conspiratorially. And they give you at least 5 minutes for their own safety. And there was a BBC reporter next to him who kind of jumped in and said, yeah, Trojan horse, bollocks. But, Brian was listening, and he at least agreed with me on that one question, which is, where did this letter come from? He saw there was some value and importance in there. And that's kind of where it began. He called me a few weeks later, and we were working on it together.
It's the beginning of an amazing collaboration over a very long period of time. And we're going to get more into into the extent of the story and how they explored it together and unearthed new leads. But I want to ask the same question to the others on the panel. And so, Mukhtar, with investigating Feeding Our Futures, what was the initial tip? Where did this come from, and how did you know, especially given that this is a program that affected so many in your community, where you're from? How did you know that this was worth doing?
Yeah, it's great to be on the stage with Hamza, Syed. I really admire your work. My sister lives in Birmingham.
Oh, really?
So, and Anna, really a big fan of your work, and another great nonprofit news that's doing amazing work. Yeah, for the Feeding Our Future, our case is a little bit different from, I think, what these two projects will be talking about, because it's really covering the community from a perspective that a lot of people might not agree who are from the community. We got a tip early on from one person who used to work at an organization called Feeding Our Future. That's actually the organization that is sponsored a lot of nonprofit organizations in the community. So it's the intermediary that's in between the community and the state. So you have to apply to participate in this program through the Feeding Our Future, and then the Feeding Our Future will submit your application to the state. So it's really a linear process. And someone who used to work at Feeding Our Future emailed us and said, the state is stopping from nonprofits from the community in participating in the program, because the state had some kind of skepticism around the idea that everyone was really trying to apply and participate without any due diligence, because this was at the height of the pandemic, so breakdowns of systems and everything else. So a lot of nonprofits who were just formed on the fly with no boards, no track record of serving communities were applying to the program, and the state was really stopping and saying, they were rejecting all the applications. So this person reached out to us and said, the state is discriminating against all these nonprofits who are from the community. And that's what when we got onto the program, we covered actually from that perspective. And this Feeding Our Future organization sued the state, and the Supreme Court actually agreed with the Feeding Our Future and said, you have to release all the funds and let these smaller nonprofits participate in the program. So we covered the case through the court system and everything else. And then we had, some rumors from the community that all these people are taking advantage of the system. They were inflating the numbers that they are serving. They were actually submitting invoices that are non-existent. And there's just a lot of, rumor in the community, and it was kind of an open secret that people were actually gaming the system. So that's when we got in, and the FBI came in and sealed a search warrant, which was the beginning of actually our investigation in terms of connecting the dots and identifying the public figures who are involved in this, people who are sitting on public housing agencies and who are policy aides in the city hall, at Minneapolis City Hall, and just trying to really connect the dots and see if we can shape the coverage from that perspective so that our peers will also follow our lead. Because early on, the local media really covers, the Somali community, particularly from a bad angle, and it's all about terrorism and national security, as Azmat knows, and crime and all of that, immigration, and they just lump the whole community as, bad part of the problem, which is not the case. So when we came in, we actually shaped the narrative and said these individuals are actually who are gaming the system, and it's not the whole community. And I think every media outlet just took from our angle and took it from there, and you won't see, the Star Tribune or even New York Times came to Minneapolis to write about the program. It was really focused on the program, and I think that's really the impact that we had in covering the cases, because we were early on, we were shaping the coverage, we were the first one, and everyone else, the local media and national media, were just following our lead in terms of really focusing on the individual cases and not the whole community.
No, this is truly, it's extraordinary, because there were much bigger newsrooms there. There were outlets with a lot of power, and yet yours was the one that really set the standard in looking at this and uncovering what went wrong. And, in many ways, so much of that is about having deep community roots and hearing what's happening, but also just Sahan Journal's overall approach. Can you talk a little bit about what that approach is and tips others might be able to take and how they conceive of these kinds of stories?
Yeah, I mean, investigative reporters like to, change the system, expose wrongdoing, and you just come from aggressive, perspective. And in our case, actually, we stepped back and said, are we actually contributing to the harm, and how will this, if we just focus on this case too deeply, how will the system actually, because this was designed for the community, and people in the community are taking advantage of something that will have benefited the community. And I think when you look at from that perspective, you will have some understanding on how to write the story, who to focus on, and everything else. And the big problem here was some of the people we were writing about, I knew them. I was praying next to them at the mosque. I covered one of the guys who was the policy aide for the Minneapolis mayor, or someone I used to have coffee when I used to cover Minneapolis City Hall. So these are people that I knew in the community, and we just tried to really center this story on people who have some kind of standing in the community, and see if we can really shape it around that way, but also making sure we are covering it in a very respectful way and not contributing to the systemic issues that have been happening in the mainstream community when they cover communities of color.
Okay, we're going to come back to this and the reaction it had in the community, but I want to turn to you, Anna. You've done extraordinary reporting, really just, I can't wait until we get to hear how she began all of this and how this has been a beat she's been on for so long. But it's so fascinating to me, the players involved, celebrities involved, sports stars involved. You uncovered a really incredible look at how money meant for the most poor, where it was going and to whom and for what, and the fraud involved. I mean, this has resulted in criminal prosecutions in which people have been found guilty. Where did it all come from? How did it start for you?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because there's some parallels with my story and the stories that you just heard, starting with a story that came out in 2017 from a report that found that Mississippi was approving less than 2% of people who are applying for cash welfare assistance. So this program I'm talking about, it's the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. It's a block grant that started in the 90s during welfare reform, and it gives block grants a set amount of money to states every year for them to spend on cash assistance to poor families, usually known as the welfare check, or just innovative programs designed to interrupt generational poverty. But the guidelines are so lax that states can really do whatever they want with the money, as long as they can kind of just say that any number of these programs fit into some vague goal of either promoting two-parent families or preventing out-of-wedlock pregnancy. And so back in 2017, when I found out that we were approving so few families for cash welfare in the poorest state in the country, where we certainly have, thousands of families living in poverty, I wanted to know where the rest of the money was going, because we still get that money every year. And I, had started doing research on the program and found that, only around 5 to 10% of the money that we got every year was actually being spent on cash assistance for poor families. But the state's programming and the goals and the ways that they were spending the money outside of cash assistance were very kind of nebulous and not well defined and very hard to see in action. And so at that time in 2017, I started filing public records requests with the Department of Human Services, the state agency that administers these funds. This is an agency that it doesn't have a board, so it doesn't have a really good oversight function, but it's a department strictly under the governor's office, and the director of that agency takes its direction from the governor. So started sending public records requests in 2017. They sent me, they were really good at giving me like exactly what I was not looking for. They do have to submit federal reports showing how the money is spent, but these are very vague reports that just kind of give general categories with dollar amounts, no receipts or expenditure reports or anything of any detail to show how they were spending the money, and more importantly, how what they were spending the money on was actually doing anything to solve poverty, right? How did our poverty rate change as a result of these programs? There was no evidence of any of this. So starting in 2017, filing public records requests. In 2018, I was getting so frustrated because they had kind of, strung me along and sent me these things that didn't make any sense. They would never answer any phone calls. And so I went to Mississippi Today in about mid-2018, and I told them that I wanted them to hire me on. I was at the Clarion Ledger before this, when I started this story. And I went to Mississippi Today, and I asked them if they would hire me specifically to cover poverty so that I could really dig into the issue of poverty as a whole, but also specifically these public assistance programs. What is going on with them? Why are they being so secretive? And I had filed a complaint at that time against the agency, and I kind of brought that complaint over with me to Mississippi Today, and they were very supportive of me, just kind of like let me loose on this topic. And I dug in. I remember like one of the first emails I sent my editor when I got there was like, I am investigating the state's TANF program. And I'm sure he was kind of like, okay, that's fine. And we didn't know, what kind of fraud was occurring. We didn't know how big of a story it was going to be. But we just kept pulling that thread and putting pressure on the agency. And there was one employee at the agency in particular that I was talking to at the time who would sometimes, return my calls and just kind of like try to temper me a little bit. And that employee, I didn't know at the time, but he was gathering some evidence of suspected fraud against his superior to take to the governor, who then turned that information over to the auditor. It's kind of funny because the auditor is credited with starting the investigation into the actual fraud here. And he was one of the first people that I called when I got the job at Mississippi Today and said, I think DHS would be a good subject for an audit. It turns out it was a really good subject for an audit. So he started his investigation in 2019. At the same time, I'm still pulling records, reporting stories about specifically these two nonprofits that were getting tens of millions of dollars from this welfare program with, very little like evidence of what they were doing. There were a lot of glossy like brochures and sort of promotional campaigns about how we were stabilizing the family, but there wasn't a lot of evidence of what was actually occurring. And then the arrests came in 2020, and in which one of those nonprofit founders and the director were charged with actual embezzlement, and that sort of broke, the story wide open and led me down, all the paths that I've gone down in the past 3 years, to really finding out who received all the money and who was all responsible for this tragedy.
So let's just start with that small tip. The initial sort of what this whistleblower went on to report. I believe it was related to addiction or training on addiction classes he was supposed to run. How much money was that, and where did it actually go?
So that's the funny thing. The tip that the employee brought forward, so just to back up a little bit, all told, we're talking about nearly $80 million that was misspent here out of the state's welfare fund, spent on things that, did not comply with federal law, did not help the needy, went to people who were not needy, and even more egregious things like building a volleyball stadium at Southern Mississippi, or supporting a pharmaceutical startup company that wanted to develop a drug and make millions of dollars for Brett Favre, which we can get into. But your question was, what was the initial tip? And it was a very small tip. It was $48,000 that the director was said to have steered to a former professional wrestler, the son of the WWE $1 million man named Ted DiBiase. This is sort of a WWE wrestling family that lives in Mississippi now and does Christian ministry, and that's how they got kind of linked up with the welfare program, is that they were going to be preaching, the word of Christ to inner city youth in Jackson, which is apparently an appropriate use of welfare money in the eyes of our government. But the relationship between the director of the agency and the wrestling family, and particularly the two sons, was really strange. He had these wrestlers kind of following him around, and no one really understood what they were trying to do or like what purpose they had at the agency. But it was a $48,000 contract that he gave to one of the sons, who the contract was to provide opioid addiction education to state employees across the state. classes that he was not conducting because he himself was in rehab at the time, which we also paid for with $160,000 in welfare money. So it was a relatively small tip, but when the auditor, pulled on that thread, it really began to unravel and ended up touching, Brett Favre and other celebrity athletes, but also, all the way up to the former governor.
It's incredible. I want to just turn to what you had mentioned about that initial relationship you had with this person who would sometimes call you up, this person who would become a whistleblower. Were they, how did you develop that relationship with them? And what tips would you have to others who are maybe trying to pursue, this kind of reporting, not just in terms of your relationship with them, but the overall approach you took, maybe how many people you were reaching out to and the attitude you took towards how many it might take?
So this employee, it's a little hard to stomach calling him the whistleblower, because we would later find out that he was so involved in creating the sort of legal workarounds that allowed for the money to be used in all of these sort of, outrageous ways. But there was another source that I think might be more useful to talk about, the source that eventually ended up giving me the text messages that I needed to really delve into the former governor's role in helping Brett Favre secure these funds from the welfare agency. Phil Bryant, again, appointed this director who's now most certainly going to go to prison, and this director was certainly taking his direction from the governor. And for the 2 years after the arrests in 2020, it was our big sort of mission to just examine that role that the governor played. I mean, it was the big question, why isn't the governor facing any kind of accountability here for allowing the state's welfare department to just be the subject of such corruption? And how I developed the source that gave me the text messages was really just that I had done so much work on this story for years, prior to any arrests, prior to anyone else really knowing about the story, that I had so much context and sort of institutional knowledge around the program that I was able to put together really comprehensive materials, really almost building a legal case, in terms of what was out there. And so there were people who gravitated towards that, people who were trying to figure out what happened with this money and what happened, just even the context of what this program is and what it's allowed to do. And in being a resource for them, they almost had to come to me to, almost commiserate over the situation that we were all in trying to, really just banging our heads against the wall, trying to unravel this web. So that's how that source was developed. And I think that, just sticking with, I've talked a lot about this with other reporters, when do you decide not to deal with a source anymore? If they're just too crazy, or, they just want to talk to you all the time, or, at what point do you draw the line? And I've always kind of gone the extra mile, just hear them out. Maybe they do actually have some information, and just being really patient with people. And that ended up being really fruitful in this case, because I ended up getting, thousands and thousands of pages of text messages that sort of broke the story wide open.
And that kind of approach can be especially useful and possible to do when you're maybe on you have a longer timeline, or you have a beat. I think it's so impressive that you built your own beat. You asked to cover poverty, and you were able to make that what you did over time. So it's really incredible. Hamza, I want to turn to you also to talk a little bit about sourcing. So you know that you want to investigate this letter, who wrote it and why. The letter did name one person to whom you went, I think, first to. Can you describe that relationship and how you started to source yourself within the community?
It was humiliating. I'll be honest with you. It took forever. Not with the hair, who...
the person referenced in the letter.
Yeah, the person referenced as the mastermind in the Trojan Horse, the guy who used to be a governor of a school called Parkview, and then he was given a lifetime ban from work in education. He was speaking at an event in the community about the Trojan Horse, and it was the first thing I was going to go record, and I think Brian and I had like tentatively agreed that we're going to look into the story together. So I just went up to him and got his phone number, and he actually was very easy and approachable because he's been waiting for journalists to come and speak to him for a while.
And that wasn't happening.
That wasn't happening, no. So he'd, since 2014, been like kind of begging. I mean, reporters were coming to him, but not to speak about any of that stuff. They were coming to ask him what his next plans were to blow someone up, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, they were coming from that
It
angle
was the
to him.
approach you were taking,
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like,
So, and don't get me wrong, he's wary with me too, but like, at least, you know, I told him what my focus was, and it wasn't something that he remembers a reporter coming up to him about. So he just gave me his phone number, and we went to see him not long after that. The rest of the people in the podcast was a fucking pain in the ass, I'm telling you. Oh my God.
You can hear a lot of it. It's incredible.
It took, I mean, listen, the podcast in total, I think, took about 4 years to make. I'll never work on something that long again. And the first year of that was just basically me begging people on the doorstep. And I'd go around and I'd beg, and they'd tell me to fuck off, and I'd go around and I'd beg, and they'd threaten to call the police. And it just kept happening for about a year. And then eventually I managed to like create enough of a rapport with them, literally these like doorstep encounters, where I started making a bit more of a pitch, or at least they'd give me space, they'd give me a tea now and again so I can sip some tea while I'm out there. And I'd tell him, I'm like, I don't understand what you guys have to lose. Like, you're already, if I Google your name, good things don't come up. So what are we?
Did you actually literally say that?
Yeah. I was like, mate, I'll show you right now what comes up when I Google your name. It's horrific, right? So that's your reputation gone. Your career is finished. You got a lifetime ban. So like, what are you preserving here by not speaking to me? One more reporter will call you a terrorist? Like, so mate, who cares? You know what I mean? Like, so eventually, after enough of that, some of them said okay. And then when I started speaking to one or two, like, they would text the others to be like, oh, actually, he's all right. He seems curious. And then it kind of like started, but it took about a year. It took about a year of just like begging. And it was embarrassing. I wasn't used to that. Again, going from medicine, like one of the most trusted careers, to journalism, which is one of the worst. I was like, this is horrific. But yeah, it takes time. Patience is the key to that, yeah.
And just to give the audience a sense of some of these people, they were in all different parts of, some of them were teachers, some of them were people who had taken this letter and advocated around it, some of them were people who wanted to see religion out of schools, and some of them were people just from your own community that you were trying to connect with. To what extent do you think that your own background, coming from that community, played a role in people's decisions to talk to you or not to talk to you, or even just the approach you took when reaching out?
I think that's the thing that surprised me the most, because I thought I had like a unique selling point. I'm from the area, you know what I mean? Like, I pray in the same mosque as you, like, surely you should trust me. But actually what preceded that was I'm a journalist, and they hate journalists so much, and rightfully so. I'll never get them to like move past that, and I wouldn't even try. They don't want journalists coming to knock on their door. So the second I was coming to knock on their door as a journalist, it really didn't matter that I was like from down the road or whatever. What made them even more worried about me is people from my community who basically go and engage with such fields, journalism, politics of the sort. What does that say about you? That you've seen how these like kind of ecosystems conspire to destroy us, and that inspired you to go join their ranks. You know what I mean? It makes you look like a sick person. So like it totally negated that I was a local boy by the fact that I decided to go into journalism. And as much as I tried to explain to them that I'm not going there because I like this field, I hate it as well. I'm just going there to try to reform it in some sense. They weren't buying it. So it didn't help. And again, it took it took persistence, and it took a sequence of interviews before they really trusted that I was like looking into something proper. But yeah, I thought I massively oversold myself to Brian. I was like, yeah, mate, don't worry about it. They'll talk to us. I'm from the area. It's all fine, And no, it wasn't. Like, we were both just frozen stiff on the streets for a long time. So yeah. So
there's a very compelling case that's made, not overtly, about who might have written this letter, whose interests it served. And this is a woman named Mukhtar who I don't think you were able to talk to. Can you describe that process of trying to get to her and what occurred? And maybe just tell them a little bit about why she may have written it. Or, excuse me,
Yeah.
let me reframe that. What interest the letter served for her?
So, I mean, it's funny. Wanting to speak to this principal, head teacher, whatever word you guys use in America, was the question I actually was initially trying to ask Brian when I ambushed him backstage. I never thought he was going to say, like, oh, I'll look at this with you. So my thing that I was, like, looking to discuss with someone is, this school, there's a primary school in East Birmingham. Primary school is like kids' school. And elementary, yeah. And it's called Adley Primary School. It was, it still is, being spearheaded by this lady called Mrs. Dar. And everyone who had made even a cursory attempt to figure out the origins of that Trojan horse letter that sparked the whole case were clear that this letter must have come from someone at this school. And that's the counter-terror expert that the government sent in 2014. He had a line to the effect in his report that it must have come from this school. That's an independent judge that looked into an employment case that developed at that school. They also concluded that the letter must have come from this school. I knew this before I started the investigation because there was a Guardian article that referenced this quote from the judge specifically. Why was everyone saying that? Because the Trojan horse letter, those 4 pages that were found, it speaks specifically about 4 schools in which these plotters have supposedly already kind of like begun maneuverings to try to take over. The other 3 schools, it's barely a sentence that the letter devotes to it. And it's a sentence that is like, you can Google it within seconds, you know it's factually incorrect. So you can almost put them to one side as public knowledge and also misrepresented public knowledge. One school, Adderley, there was paragraphs about that. 4 whole paragraphs about that school in the most intricate details of what allegedly happened there. That also involved fake letters. So, you know, any reasonable person would go, oh, here's this funky letter. Oh, here's this other school where there's an allegation of several other funky letters. Let me start there first, probably. Considering none of this was public knowledge, and there's only a handful of people who would know about this. And so in the letter, it describes this bizarre incident that involves a bunch of subordinates and this head teacher, Rizwana Dar. And the situation was that Rizwana Dar basically pulled in these 4 employees one day. I'm paraphrasing a bunch of these details here, but pulled them in and said, I've accepted your resignation letter. You're free to go. And they were like, what the fuck are you talking about? We haven't resigned. And she was like, yes, you have. You can go home now. Don't come back. Give me your fob keys. And they're like, we haven't resigned. This thing develops into like a legal scandal where they're like, we did not resign. She hasn't showed us any letters. What is she talking about? Mrs. Dar was adamant, they have resigned, they're not coming back, I don't want to hear anything from them again. The council, the local government, basically investigated this. This wasn't public knowledge, we've kind of revealed this in a podcast. They investigated this. And their conclusion was, at the end of this investigation that they did, their auditors, that the letters are fake, the signatures are fake on it. They had a handwriting expert have a look at that. The names are misspelt in it, which in itself is comical. Like, you'd have to misspell your own name in your own resignation letter that you're pretending to send. Anyways, so things weren't looking good for Mrs. Dar. And this was all heading towards this employment tribunal case that the subordinates had brought against the school for unfair dismissal. And then up turns this Trojan horse letter. And it turns up and it says there's a massive citywide extremist plot to take over schools. And actually here's one of the most elaborate versions of that. There's these 4 teaching assistants at Adley Primary School who are claiming that they haven't resigned, but they actually have. And they're part of this conspiracy. It's stupid. I know, speaking it out loud, it's stupid. It's stupid. It's a stupid story. It's a farce. So you read this and you go, okay, common sense suggests Adderley Primary School is an interesting place, and specifically Rizwana Dar. So I wanted to go speak to her first, and that's kind of what I was building up to Brian with backstage, that should I just go talk to her first, get her first unvarnished take, before she might hear that I've been going around speaking to other people and like maybe gets a bit put off by that. should I go to Adelaide and speak to her first, get her to say what she needs to say, and then I can kind of embark on the rest of the investigation. Brian didn't think that was a good idea when he jumped in. He said, to be fair, he was coming at it from a place where he didn't know anything about this. He had so much catching up to do. I'd been tracking this for a number of years. So he was like, let's just understand the nature of the case. Let's go speak to Tahir, et cetera, which we did. But then we never got around to speaking to Rizwan Adar. I'll put my hand up and blame myself for that, because I sent a letter to a source that surfaced, and I'm sure we'll talk about, which, you know, even if she was inclined to speak to us, which I don't think she would have, she definitely was not going to say yes to an interview after that. But, you know, we tried. We went to the school. That was a funny encounter, because we turned up at the school unannounced, and we went to reception, and the receptionist said, she's not here. She's out for a meeting today. And Brian, he's such a lovely guy. He was like, okay, nice. Let's go back to the car. I was like, fuck that, mate. She's inside. I know she's inside. Let's just stick around. And for hours, I made him stay there in reception, and he was getting so pissed off. And then the school ended, and like someone else comes down and said, okay, she is inside, but you're not allowed to speak to her, right? But it was amazing how like the receptionist was so drilled that we just turned up unannounced. Like, we're just here, speak to Rizwan Adar, and she just knew to say she's not here. Like, it's almost like it's like a school protocol that no one gets to speak to this lady. She remains an absolute enigma. I've never seen her in real life. I've never spoken to her. And what's crazier, the thing that will blow your mind, is that since the podcast came out over a year ago now, not one journalist has called to speak to Rizwan Adar. Not one reporter. Not one reporter has even asked for comment, let alone tried to interview anyone at Adelaide Primary School. So she remains a total mystery. So we never got to speak to her. If there was ever a chance, I jeopardized it, but I don't think there's ever a chance.
So just this reporting that you did uncovered so much behind the scenes that had occurred that had never been made public, from documents the city council had, from these disputes at school, the actual incidents that were written about that were characterized as Islamism, or characterized as, I think we can refer to as creeping Sharia here, this idea that this was entering the schools. And you spoke to all of these different people in order to be able to bring to light how this letter essentially thwarted the education of so many young people in Birmingham, and actually across the country, because this resulted in a lot of political change. It played on a lot of political fears. What was the reaction that you saw from your reporting and this podcast within the community?
It's a tough one, because I was here in New York when the podcast came out, so I was kind of living it from afar through social media, trying to get a grasp of what was happening back home. And it was, you know, it was just two split kind of different reactions. The official reaction, which includes the British media, was he's a terrible person, this Hamza, and make sure he never works again, kind of thing. And that was the overall theme of this. How dare he do this story? How dare the New York Times publish this? And that continues to this day.
How dare you out-report all of them?
Yeah, how dare you? How dare you? How dare you? How dare you? And he's a reckless person. So that was kind of the official response. And then I kept hearing that there is a community response that are overwhelmed that they, had something. Yeah, actually, this is a good summary of the official response here. First of all, just any students up here, make sure you take a really sexy-looking picture to accompany your work. Because then no matter how much they try to smear you, they have to print your face still. It totally undermines all their effort. But actually, this is, okay, I'm going to read some of this. I'm going to read some of this from my phone, because this is an indication of where journalism is in Britain. And the reason I picked this is because it's the Times of London, which is like a proper paper. You know what I mean? Like, this ain't like the Daily Mail or the Sun or anything like that. They're supposed to know. And this is a news piece. Okay, one of the most downloaded podcasts in the US. It has raised fresh questions about the show's journalistic integrity. And it is now facing accusations that it may have broken a British court order. Okay, we're facing accusations by this reporter. Okay. There's no official body that has raised this accusation. Then there's a quote. It feels as if it has reopened old wounds, a senior teacher at the school said. Okay. What makes it worse is that the podcast gets so much wrong. Now, if you were a journalist and someone gives you that quote, I hope your instincts are, can you elaborate on that? What does the podcast get wrong? The quote ends there, okay? The Times can reveal this. Since the release of the podcast, teachers and governors who were implicated in what happened are using it to try to clear their names. Shut the fuck up. A piece of journalism came out that suggests there was like new details, and they're using that to say like, hey, there was new information. Isn't that our fucking job? Okay. Nick Timothy, who comes up in the podcast, Theresa May's former chief of staff, that's the Prime Minister's former chief of staff, is threatening legal action against the publisher over claims it made about his involvement. Well, where are they? Where are those legal actions? You know, we have long passed the time on that. Nick Timothy did not move. So again, you're just taking what Nick Timothy's saying without asking, is that true though, Nick? Okay. The show has already had to re-record one section after admitting it had not correctly represented the interview with Humanist UK. That is true. That is true. We had to go and say he said there was maybe 2 sources, as opposed to he said there was no sources. So that's fair. Good point there. Questions have been raised about the journalistic rigor of the presenters. Hamza Syed was a student, true, who expresses clear bias throughout the series. We can talk about the whole bias in the series stuff. That's a whole thing to unpack. At the time the anonymous letter emerged in 2013, an investigation found that it was probably fake. We don't linger on this. You know, it was probably fake, and yet we've allowed so much serious stuff to happen. We don't linger on that or reflect on that. But concerns about the safeguarding of children were discovered. It's so passive. Who discovered them? What was discovered? Like, what's the details here? Inquiries uncovered lessons being narrowed to comply with conservative Islamic teachings, and pupils allegedly being told that white teachers do not have your best interests at heart. Now, the fact that you still have to preface this with allegedly, and it's now, 2022, and this thing happened in 2014, that means you've done no work still to confirm any of these details, which, by the way, are not true, which we tell you in the podcast, which if you'd listened to would have been informative. Since then, staff of the school have worked hard to win back the trust of the community. That's neither here nor there for me, to be honest. The podcast may be facing claims it is in contempt of court after naming whistleblowers granted immunity in one of the many tribunal cases. Now, here's the thing which I want to highlight. Not true, obviously. Otherwise, I'd be in court right now defending myself. But the British government, knowing the podcast were coming out, sent around a letter to all the editors of newspapers and broadcast networks to basically say, this podcast violates a court order or may violate a court order, and which protects a few whistleblowers in this Trojan horse story. So essentially, be wary and don't report on it. We didn't know this. And for about a week, we were on this kind of like ridiculous PR kind of like campaign when the podcast comes out, doing a bunch of interviews, and no news reporter is engaging with us. It's all like artists and critics, you know, like that's the thing with doing a podcast. It kind of falls in this weird space where it's media as well. So again, loads of just people just talking about the aesthetics and stuff.
Got it.
And then this Guardian reporter called and said like, oh, it's funny, I had this whole interview lined up for you guys, but I had to change it because my editor called and said, no, there's like a court order. So just ask them about how them two became friends or something, you know?
Which is a question we'll get to in a little bit.
I'm
too,
sure
yeah.
we will. Yeah, I'm sure we will. So she tells us this is the first time we hear that this is letter going around from the government saying don't basically ask these guys any follow-ups about this. So now we're pissed off for a number of reasons because it took about a year with standards and legal, the New York Times, to make sure that we went nowhere near that court order. So we took so much care to make sure everything that was reported goes nowhere near this court order that does exist, that does affect the case, which we did not speak to at all.
Got it.
So given this, no effort was made by any journalist, editor, their legal team to contact us. Instead of just getting this threatening-looking letter from the government, deciding, well, it is in their best interest for us not to cover this story. Let's just do our due diligence and follow up. Ask them, what specifically in this podcast can we not go near?
Right.
Because the other stuff we will speak about, no. Just a blanket ban on reporting about the Trojan horse because of this letter.
I think in some ways it's a legacy of their own making, right? That they would have to correct in coming back to this and reporting on this. And it seems like they're very conveniently using this court order to not have to rehash that. And I want to actually, if I may, I want to turn back to you, Mukhtar, and ask you a similar question about the reaction within your community, because so often as people of color, we are often, focused on telling stories that illuminate a variety of perspectives that aren't often seen in our communities. And this is one that, some might describe as airing the dirty laundry. And what effect did it have within the community and also with Sahan Journal's relationship with the community?
So some context, we launched Sahan Journal in late 2019. So when we have been covering these cases, we were like 3 years.
Can you tell them a little bit about why you launched Sahan Journal?
Oh, sure. I worked in some of the largest newsrooms in the state, Minnesota Public Radio, which is one of the largest, radio stations in the country, and Minneapolis Star Tribune, a large regional newspaper, and really doing well with almost 200 reporters. I was covering City Hall. I was fresh out of Columbia Journalism School. I was really interested in doing accountability, investigative journalism, and I was covering Minneapolis City Hall for the paper, and kind of noticed that one of the largest newspaper, the paper of record for Minnesota, is not really doing a good job in covering Minnesota's diverse communities, especially immigrants and this growing population. Right, Minnesota is really changing very fast as the rest of the country is happening. And I was kind of, as I was building my career in local newsrooms in the state, felt we weren't doing a good job in really reflecting the experiences and the richness of our state. And that kind of inspired me to really just leave out of the mainstream newsroom to build something that I hoped will provide a space to gather and report from a really high quality journalism perspective, right? We have very vibrant ethnic media outlets that do good work, but there's no one newsroom that kind of provides high quality journalism that anyone can read, including the white community in the state. And so left the newspaper in late 2018. This was a big risk. I had a family, and I was really told not to do it. From editors, I was doing good work, really investigating good work for the paper, and then I left, launched the newspaper, the news online website in late 2019. For the first 12 months, it was just me trying to fundraise, learn how to fundraise. I was strictly a reporter, a beat reporter with two journalism degrees. I had no idea about business or how to fundraise or how to build organization or how to manage people. So for the first 12 months, I was just reading a lot of case studies that Institute for Nonprofit News published, thanks to Cross, and trying to understand the business model of nonprofit news. So the first 12 months, it was just really learning the ropes of news business. And we got 3 RFL reporters, Report for America journalists, 5 days after George Floyd was killed. So that's when actually we were trying to build the newsroom, and we were excited to have reporters from Report for America. And we have an editor, and now George Floyd was killed. And it was like, wow, our mission actually is needed right now more than ever. And we have been out in the streets trying to convene the community to discuss issues that are relevant to them. Just also, grappling with our own space as, journalists, if we are contributing to everything that has been happening in the state of Minnesota in terms of racism and letting the system really harm communities. And it was really a pivotal moment for me to kind of think the role of journalism in our space after George Floyd was killed.
And I can imagine that reporting really invigorated the community to see that kind of accountability reporting for what's happening to many people in your community, but to kind of jump ahead in time a little bit. And I really encourage you to look at Sahan Journal's body of reporting over years. It's extraordinary. Yeah. But by the time you got to the Feeding Our Future story, it's a different approach, right? It shines a spotlight on some things that can be a little harder for people to admit. And how did that kind of transition, going from George Floyd and some of the other kinds of stories you were telling to that, what impact did that have on the community?
Yeah, so we are known to really provide a space in covering people breaking barriers in the community, education, climate, environment, health, politics, everything. And now we are facing this big situation in front of us where we are really covering this big story, fraud happening in the Somali community. And as we have been, investigating, covering the cases and getting documents from the state and trying to connect the dots and everything else, we have been getting a lot of calls and pushback from like nearly everyone. People have been calling my in-laws and my family and imams in the community saying, what is Mukhtar doing? Is he out of his mind? Why is he writing this stuff? What's he
I
going
would
to
die
benefit?
if my mom called me about my reporting.
And is he an FBI agent? Does he work for the feds? So really a lot of rumors in the community of our standing. But also I think it also really gives me a good perspective of my time in the Star Tribune and NPR and other places. I will cover stories and I won't get a lot of feedback. I won't get a lot of pushback. I will just do my work and move on. And now the community is really trying to, stop us from this, from doing this coverage, because I think they see Sahan Journal as a space that's for them. And they have a stake in what we do, and they have this power and confidence in coming after us and trying to make us stop, from reporting the stories. And I think that's kind of positive for the community to see a space that they think they own, and it's for them, and for us to get that pushback and calls and emails and newsletters and everything. I think it was really positive, and we learned a lot from it in terms of we really knew what was going on. And I think that angered a lot of people in the community who are deeply involved in the cases, and we knew who was part of it, who are connecting with us, who are naming them. And the goal was, for me, was if we can do this and the community understands that if they do something illegal, we will point that out. And the end goal, I think, for me is I don't want for my community to be in this space in 5, 10, 15 years. I want them to know that they will be held accountable if they do something negative, but also for them to know that there's a space. And this is the first time that there's a journalism outlet that's really covering communities of color in Minnesota from a really high journalistic level, right? This has never happened before. And we are very new. We are learning all this stuff, and we have the trust of the community. But sometimes we have to really cover, the good, the bad, and everything between. That's why we're journalists, and that's why we need to capture all the voices in the community as things unfold. But it was really very challenging time, and we think about impact, and toppling the systems and wrongdoing and exposure and all of that, and that's all good. But like that could be very different when you are from the community, when you are really living and breathing, and you are, like 2 weeks ago, I was in the same space with some people that we covered, and it was really awkward. And that's, how close we got to this story. But I think when the indictments happened, around 50 people have been charged so far, about 6 months ago, 8 months ago. And the pushback and the calls and everything really stopped. Because now people know that this is bigger than Sahan Journal, and what we have been doing has been validated by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and things are really quiet now.
Yeah. It's incredible. I really love also what you described about how, you want your community to do well. You want them to know that there's somebody, that there are journalists that will focus on this when this happens. And that is just truly, I believe it will have transformative impacts far beyond 50 prosecutions, right? Mm-hmm. It's what happens in the future.
Yeah, and the case is really ongoing. This is, FBI agents are working on this case around the clock. So it's not something that just stopped, but I think people now understand the gravity of the problem and the issue, and that we are just really doing our jobs, and people should stop calling us when they see something negative in our story, in our website, because we are really doing a diverse, wide-ranging stories, and this is just part of it. And for people to understand there's a journalism outlet for the community, by the community, and we will be capturing things as they happen. I think it also really, a lot of people also trusted us through that process, because we gave in the pressure we have been getting and everything else, and we have been getting a lot of also positive really feedback, people saying That's when we got the most donations, actually. We're a nonprofit, and people have been donating through that period, just really admiring and appreciating how we have been capturing the voices as they happen in a very respectful way.
That's beautiful. And now when Sahan Journal reporters are making calls, do they get a very different reaction when they say they're from Sahan Journal?
Oh yeah, I mean, people know us now. Though we have been around for 3-4 years, I think the credibility and the brand awareness is really out there, and people really trust us, and they send us story ideas, they answer our calls, and since that period, I think people have just a different view of what journalism is. And I think I've been also doing a lot of explanatory journalism, just trying to explain our methods, right? Because I think a lot of people don't understand how we do our work, how we do journalism, how we do reporting. And I've been doing editor's notes to the community, explaining our processes and methods and everything else. And I think that also something that really helped the community understand our space and our mission, and how journalism is really useful for everything that has been happening in the community.
Incredible, thank you. Anna, I also want to ask you about the reaction to the reporting, but first I actually want to backtrack a little bit to what you were talking about with the auditor that you were in touch with. So I think it's so fascinating when a journalist is reporting on something and there may be an oversight official tasked with investigating that, and you're working, and the kind of line that there is, and I say this as somebody who myself will, I'll interview oversight officials while I'm doing my reporting, and they'll ask me lots of questions as well and try to get threads. And can you just describe that relationship that you had with the auditors as you were doing this? And obviously you're not an advocate. You're doing your reporting. It's for the purpose of your reporting. But how might you have seen your reporting while you were in the process of doing it impact what the auditor might be looking at or focusing on?
Yeah, I had a conversation with him at some point where, we had talked about, this was like later on, we had talked about how this all came to be, and he remembered that, we were having these conversations, and sort of like philosophical conversations, because an auditor's job is very specific, and they're looking for specific red flags and specific kinds of violations of spending, but not necessarily looking at the efficacy of programs, or like, is the state doing what it should be doing to help people? That's not really the job. That's not really the question that he's trying to answer. But I think that, he definitely acknowledged that the stuff that I was talking to him about, that I was interested in exploring, did, shape the way that he was looking at these government programs, and like where he wanted to specifically focus. And then when he got the tip that initially launched the investigation, I remember he had issued just your standard annual audit around the same time that tip came in. And so it was looking at the previous year, and it wasn't very comprehensive, it wasn't very detailed. But I went in for a meeting, and just to give you the context of like, how many reporters were really caring about this or looking at it, it was me and one other reporter in the room when he released that audit. And I was sitting there asking all these really specific, weird questions, and the other reporter was kind of like, what are you doing?
You're like, this is my press conference.
And, the auditor said, I just will never forget him saying, I can't wait to read your book about DHS. And I was like, oh, I don't think anyone would read a book about DHS. And, come to find out that, maybe there will be someday. So it was all good and well, with the auditor, where, I'm using his audits to bolster the reporting. I'm using the facts that he's putting out through these audits to tell a story. But when I started poking into the governor's role, the governor who he used to serve as a campaign manager, and the governor who initially appointed him to his position as state auditor, that's where the riff came. So, we had kind of, when we got the text messages that revealed more about the governor's role, we put together a timeline that really showed that the arrests came at a very important time for the governor, because he was talking with Brett Favre and his business associate about meeting to essentially broker a deal between the former governor, now he had just left office, his new lobbying company, and the pharmaceutical company that received welfare money. They were discussing meeting times and getting ready to to, at one point they said if Brett Favre comes, it will seal the deal. On February 4th, 2020, the auditor made his arrests on February 5th, 2020, which essentially derailed the arrangement. So when we were looking at that specific question of the timing and, what did the auditor know and how did that impact, how he decided to kind of make these hasty arrests, that's when, the relationship wasn't as strong anymore in terms of being able to communicate openly.
And this really rich body of reporting, these very public arrests and prosecutions must have dramatically changed how people view public assistance and their political leaders, and just the complexity of what you're describing in terms of people across government who are involved and the celebrities who are involved. What impact did it have in the state?
Well, so yeah, I was thinking about your question a second ago about people's reaction, because I think one of the most encouraging things that I've found through the reporting is, because I think that reporting in this area where you're kind of uplifting the voices of marginalized people and looking at public assistance programming in Mississippi and just, pointing out why it's not working, can be painted as a sort of a liberal cause. And I'm in a very, red conservative state. But I found that when we were putting out our stories, which were so tight and so fact-based and so just like, straight to the point, that, we now have like a bunch of conservative fans of Mississippi Today now, because they love the reporting. Mississippians are craving truth, and they're craving some greater understanding of why we are living in the conditions that we're living in. And these stories go a long way in explaining that, no matter what your political leanings are, and most everyone, unless you're in a position that's threatened by people having that knowledge, are in favor of it.
I mean, that's such a lesson. Thank you. Like, in a climate where there's so much distrust of news media, I mean, this is such an example, such a case study for others to really think about and follow. And I especially appreciate your talking about how tightly it was written and how fact-based, and it's truly extraordinary. I want to ask each of you a question about confronting people in the course of your reporting, and your own sort of how you prepared to do that, how it went, and the kind of way that it informed the reporting and allowed people to see you're taking these questions to somebody who needs to be asked really tough questions. So why don't we start with you, Hamza? You had some very confrontational interviews. Why don't you just describe one, maybe, and the approach that you took?
I love it, first of all. It's kind of my favorite type of interview. I don't like going there and asking like, hey, tell me about whatever, describe this or describe that. That's kind of, and that's why I was glad.
So you want me to put you on the spot, is what you're saying?
Yeah. That's why it was kind of a nice marriage with Brian, because he is very much like a storyteller in that sense. Like, he wants all that kind of background detail to bring the scene to life. I'm just looking to destroy people. So like, it would get tense between us, because like sometimes, for example, if someone is giving you an hour for an interview, and Brian would take 20 minutes of that, talking about a poster on the wall that he enjoyed with the person that we're talking to, I'd get pissed, because I'm like, mate, now we got 40 minutes. And so that 20 minutes would just build to tension where I just like, okay, can we just, all right, what the fuck did you do? Kind of, you know what I mean? Like that kind of situation. So we very much had that dynamic of good cop, bad cop, if you want to call it that. And I love it. Like, I think it's important to be aggressive if you have the evidence to support what you're doing. You know what I mean? Like, don't go in there and be a pantomime, like, and hoping through bluster to learn something, because that's not going to work. But I'm like, if you have information that is incriminating, if you have facts to speak to, then you should have the balls to walk into a room, look someone in the eye and go, like, explain this to me. And keep repeating that question until they explain it to you. Or if they can't, make a show of the fact that they can't explain it to you. Like, that's what I live for, is those kind of confrontational interviews. And I do think, like, some people say there's no value in that. I'm not sure if Brian still kind of fully believes in the aesthetics of that. But I think there is. I think there's something so tedious about going over and over and hearing some circular bollocks from an official for an hour. and then maybe in some kind of narration afterwards saying, well, he was equivocating here, blah, blah, blah. Fuck that. In the room, say to him, mate, why are you not answering my question? You know what I mean? Like, I think there's something revealing in that exchange if you can speak that forcefully with someone and have them still dithering. There's a truth in that. I'm not saying you're going to get a confession, but you're going to get a truth to something. So I believe in that. I look forward to those encounters when they existed. I remember at one point, we went down to the House of Commons in London where all the MPs are, and there was this politician who, within 5 minutes of us speaking to him, he ran away. He got up and ran away. And I was celebrating, like, that's the best interview we've done in the series. Like, I was like, mate, great, we got him. And Brian was, like, so confused and devastated and was trying to do follow-ups and emailing the press. I was like, mate, it's done, it's done, he's ran away.
He made his choice.
But yeah, I'm sick like that. I really, really enjoy those moments, and I look to create them.
That is one approach, and also so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Mukhtar, can you talk a little bit about, confronting some of those who were involved in the misuse of this money from feeding our families? What did that look like? How did you prepare for it? And, what did you choose to use from some of those confrontations in the stories?
Yeah, so I was not reporting on these stories around these cases. I was supervising and giving guidance and all that.
Yeah.
But before, just another, when I was covering Minneapolis City Hall for the paper, Star Tribune, there was a chair for the Public Safety Committee, and there was a big killing around, that time. And she was absent from chairing the committees, and she had a lot of absences. I analyzed her track record of attendance by just downloading, her attendance records from the City of Minneapolis website, and find out that she was really not attending meetings, and she was the chair of the Public Safety Committee. And I tried to email her, tried to contact her policy aide, tried to find any means to really meet her. And I had, this amazing story of saying, the chair of the Public Safety Committee is absent from, chairing the committee and all that. And there was, I met her at the coffee just randomly when I was trying to buy stuff. And I said, hey, I've been trying to reach you for a while. Do you have a few minutes to talk about, your record of attendance at the Minneapolis City Hall Committee? And she really sat down with me for like 30 minutes. We talked, asked her why she was absent. She was like, I was on vacation. I had other family matters when this happened and all of that. We did this story. It was on the front page. And as soon as it came out, she blocked me on Twitter. One Twitter was good. One Twitter was very popular and all that. And that.
Did you love that as much as Hamza liked the walking out, the blocking?
She didn't walk out, but she was really, she cannot ignore me now. I'm standing in front of her, and that opportunity really gave me time to, because I didn't want to try this story based on the data, right? I think I really like to slow down and wait and get the perspective and the answers of people involved in my stories. And that can really bring more nuance and richness to the reporting. And that was a good time for me to really sit down with her and talk to her. But for her to block me on Twitter really also triggered a new policy in the city of Minneapolis of elected officials and their usage of Twitter, and that created another really big drama in City Hall and for the mayor as well.
So did you announce it? Did you publicly say I've been blocked on Twitter? Or
oh yeah,
how did that material?
Yeah. I said the Public Safety Committee chair blocked me on Twitter, and all the freedom, expression and everything else just came on board and really pushed the state to the city to do a policy around how public officials use their Twitter. And if they have a Twitter account, it has to be for official usage purposes. And if they have a private account, they can make it private, and they don't have to use and tweet about the policies and the ordinances and everything that they have been working on. But if they are using it for official purposes, they should not be blocking reporters.
That's incredible. So both you, that's amazing. So both Mukhtar and Hamza just described situations in which they were denied something, they were blocked, they were walked out on, and it seems like it really did serve a very useful public function to make that transparent, to make that known. I know, Hamza, when I was listening to the podcast, it was incredibly powerful to see people walk out or just kind of shut things down or end interviews. And it really tells the listener, the audience a lot. So thank you both for really taking that approach to making that public. Because so often as reporters, we can bend over backwards to try to reach somebody. And sometimes there are, the way of confronting is to start asking those questions and then to make public in real time the response that you're getting to that. So thank you. Anna, do you want to talk a little bit about confrontation and some of those more aggressive interviews that have to happen sometimes?
Sure. Brett Favre also blocked me on Twitter. I don't know if I explained who Brett Favre is. He's like a former quarterback.
Minnesota Vikings. It all goes back to Minnesota.
So there was like a few back and forth, text messages. I never got to sit down with Brett Favre. I did go to his house at one point and, clicked on the buzzer for the house and the barn, but no response. We did have a couple text exchanges, where he used a lot of exclamation points and tried to convince me that the projects that he was working on were strictly for economic development, Anna, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. But I think do we have the clip of the, yeah, so of course, before publishing the text messages, had to reach out to the governor, and this is a governor who, I don't think he had certainly not done an interview with any media since leaving office, and he very rarely sat down with any media during his time in office too. I think I had maybe had like one actual conversation with him, like after a press conference at some point in my career, but he had never granted me an interview before. So when I called trying to get this interview about the text messages, he initially just said no. And I kind of talked to the guy who was representing him like, well, this is what we're going to publish, and these are what the text messages show. And he says no, and I call him back again. I'm like, are you sure you don't want to say anything about, these text messages where the governor is promising to open a hole for Brett Favre, just a few days before he meets with the nonprofit director who then gives him $2 million in welfare money. And Brett Favre had also texted the governor, thank you for the money that we're getting from the state. We're so happy about it. So I sat down with him. He after I kind of explained further, like, hey, are you sure? His PR guy calls me back and he says, actually, you know what? We do want to sit down. And he was out of town that day, so it had to be a different day. And I was kind of on a tight deadline. I said, can we just have a phone call? He says, no, we want to sit down because he wants to look you in the eye. Because he's worried about crucifixion by innuendo. Okay. So we sit down on a Saturday, because we're publishing on Monday, and we're not going to push our pub date. And we sit down for 3 hours while I kind of read out the text messages and get him to explain, like, line by line, what did you mean here? And so I pieced together just a little bit of that interview, which...
Here's the important thing, and I think the important thing. I never asked for,
It's a little...
received,
Can we make it a little louder?
or wanted stock in that company. Never. Here's the important thing, and I think the important thing. I never asked for, received, or wanted stock in that company. Never. Now, were they offering that? Look, people come up to you all the time and say, oh man, I'd like you to do this, I want you to do that. And I try to be nice and say, thank you very much, we can talk about it later. But if you notice, I didn't take it. I turned that down. I could have said, okay, let's say I leave office on the 15th. Well, 2 weeks later, I could have said, well, transfer it, whatever the stock looks like. I'm not sure how you do that. But
would that be appropriate?
no, it wouldn't be appropriate. That's why I didn't do it.
But if you had like assisted a company while you were in office and then took ownership in it
I would be wrong.
2 days after you left.
Be careful.
Okay.
I love that.
That's why I didn't do it.
So in early January, Brett told Jake, I think you should offer the governor a package that will get him determined to see it through. On January 16th, Jake said, I'd like to give you a company package for all your help. You responded, sounds good. Where would be the best place to meet? I am now going to get on it hard. I mean, this is really serious. It appears as if you've helped this company along in your last year in office,
Understand.
and then answered affirmatively when asked about taking stock.
Yeah.
And the fact that you never did is because those arrests were made before you were able to seal the deal.
But I had time in between there.
On
Okay.
February 4th, you were talking about meeting, and then on February 5th, the arrests happened.
I think that's it.
Wow.
So was there a lot of deep eye contact as all of this was happening?
Yeah. Crucifixion by innuendo.
Just all the receipts. Before we open it up to a Q&A, I want to actually turn back to you, Hamza, because I think we should hear the approach. I think it's so fascinating and transparent, and I think we have a clip of that as well. I don't know if you want to set it up before we play.
Oh, this bit. Actually, this clip just demonstrates how insufferable I am to work with. But also, I want to highlight something which is relevant to the theme of this symposium facts. We'll play the clip, and I'll tell you about it after.
This averting of the national gaze from Adderley. I think it's why politicians like Albert Bohr and Bridget Jones have been able to equivocate, why misconceptions have festered, why the Trojan horse affair has eluded genuine understanding all these years. The way nearly everyone else talks about this story, it's powerful. At times it's made me question how Hamza and I are approaching it.
Imagine we got it wrong.
I do imagine that. You don't. I do. I have had moments when I've said to myself, we've got to be the ones thinking about this backwards. There must be something I'm misunderstanding as a foreigner relatively new to this event. And am I making just an epic miscalculation by casting my lot with this lapsed, often overconfident doctor, squatting in his pants apartment? The fact that so many people have looked into this independently, from the cops to counter-terror expert from Scotland Yard to an independent investigator for the council to other reporters, you know, it makes you wonder if maybe you're out of your mind.
Nah.
Like, why are we? It's enough to make me second guess.
Nah. It makes me second guess them.
Okay, so here's why I wanted to play this clip. I've been in journalism for about 2 minutes, you know what I mean? This was my first story. I was still a student when I was doing it. So, like, far from me to speak to what all of you guys have done for, like, your entire careers and stuff like this. But there's one thing which I could not understand about journalism, which is the more we learned, the harder facts we discovered, the more confidence people were losing in my team of being able to speak forthrightly about what happened in this case. And I don't know whether that's just, you know, a symptom of this story or whether that's a repeated kind of like, I don't know, behavior that happens in newsrooms. But I couldn't understand why we were becoming more fidgety and nervous the more progress we were making into this case. And the amount of effort that we made to basically undermine ourselves or try to find something to undermine ourselves, and we kept falling short because we were developing towards the truth. And yet it was just like harder and harder for me to get everyone else to be buoyed by that. There was a nervousness.
Like the stakes are getting higher?
The stakes are getting higher. We're about to reveal something pretty damning. Is this for real? And on the one sense, I could totally understand, like in terms of as a practice, to be like always unsure. You never want to report mistruths, blah, blah, blah. I get all of that. But I never see that kind of courtesy or kind of unease extended to, okay, go back to 2014 when the Trojan horse was first being reported on. Who was being careful then? Who was being shy about what they were saying then? So when there is a situation that affects Muslims and you're reporting on the first time, I see some of the most ridiculous, most unhinged headlines and the most like, you know, declarative statements about what happened. And yet a 4-year piece of investigative journalism that says actually that might not be the case, every single step of the way, every new document that we got, every new detail that we learned, every new interview that we did, there was just a collective kind of like, I don't know, unease that was settling in that like, oh my God, this is actually bullshit, right? And I could not understand why we weren't being more aggressive with that. I still don't get it. Like, you know, the podcast comes out in the way that it does because, you know, you work with the whole team and ultimately you have to compromise. But I didn't understand the compromise. And the second something is factually correct and has been legally verified and standards have looked at it and everyone agrees that this is it, then let me go fucking use this then, you know? That's why I did this work, to learn the truth. This is the truth. Let me go speak this confidently. And it is the reason I think why facts are being undermined is because we don't fucking know how to use them. We get unnerved by facts. The more facts you gather, the more certain you are that you're missing something. It's such a backwards phenomenon. And I think journalism needs to grapple with that because I think stories need to be told in a different kind of way once you have the facts to support it. And if you don't, by all means, be kind of nebulous, be a bit more confused, be a bit more like, here's all sides of the conversation. But once you've learned something, and that's investigative journalism, once you've learned something, fucking use it, speak to it. So this phenomenon that kind of Brian was settling into, you know, it was, that was the case for the entire 4 years, where it was like, are we sure though? You know, and I get it, the optics do look weird. Like here's this guy who's, you know, who's still qualifying from journalism, and then here's this country that says, like, this is what happened. I get it, the optics are bad, but unless you live in a world where you think all of our officials are good-natured, decent people, and like, you know, we should always just respect what they say. If you live in that world, don't be a reporter, first of all. Like, we don't need you. But unless you're of that mind, then this is the job that we do. We uncover what they were lying about, and we speak to that. And we don't try to mitigate it. We don't try to excuse it. We don't try to dampen it. We don't try to be civil with it. Why are we being civil with it? Who are we protecting? We're being civil. So I just wanted to play this as like, if we're sitting here wondering why facts are starting to lose value, it's because we don't know how to use them. And the second you acquire a fact, it's so hard to do that. It's so hard to do that because of all the reasons we talked about today, of people obstructing that process. The second you acquire one, then please make something with it. Make something with it, because that's the only way you're going to mitigate against them obscuring these details coming out. So the Trojan horse sounds like it does, but I do wonder what it would have sounded like if it was my student project, because I would not have held back, you know. Yeah.
Oh, well, actually, so we're going to actually open this up now to questions, and maybe that can be the first one. You said, how would it have been different had he done it on his own? Do you want to?
I mean, the first thing I think, it wouldn't have been a daily battle for me to convince everyone that we should be able to say this now. That whole dilemma of just like, you're from the community and you're Muslim, and so you should kind of be wary of that in terms of the charge of bias that's likely to come your way. To be honest, I wasn't thinking that when I was doing it as a student project. I didn't really care. Because my whole thing was, so long as I learn the information, so long as I accumulate the facts, doesn't matter what people think of me. You know what I mean? As long as this thing is watertight, it really doesn't matter what you think of me. You have to engage with the information. And so it was only when it started becoming, I didn't go pitch this to the New York Times. Like, I met Brian, he was working at This American Life. Then this went over to Serial when it became like too hard for them to accommodate, or too long for them to accommodate. Then Serial was acquired by the New York Times. So by the time this was coming out, it looks like, you know, I was like gunning for the New York Times. I wasn't. So I was kind of Forrest Gumping my way through journalism. And so like this, so as the stakes were rising, as this was becoming like a New York Times and Serial thing, you know, there's so many people then involved with the story and so much like tension. I remember at one point, like, listen, podcast goes through the rigorous routine. It's like, I think some of the most looked over journalism I think you can have as a podcast series.
It had to be after.
Yeah, after Caliphate, yeah. Let's speak to that monster. So this is a podcast series. New York Times have had a shocker with another one, so they want to make sure they get this right. Fine, I get all of that. But this is going to the point of like, I say we a lot in my narration when I'm speaking about Birmingham Muslims. I say we. It would be so confusing and like alien for me to say anything other than we. I'm a Muslim guy from Birmingham. Even that we had to discuss about whether a reporter should be able to say we when it comes to like certain people who are covered in this case. I'm like, what would you rather have me say? Them? You know what I mean? That makes no sense. Like it's such a weird way for me to speak about people who I'm from. So like the whole thing was just trying to get ahead of a thing which we were never going to satisfy the people. Like, if you're going to accuse me of bias, you're going to accuse me of bias come what may. So I didn't understand why to dance around as much as we did with the stuff that we'd learned, and why we had to imagine up till the last night whether there was, whether the officials had a right to behave that way. And I'm like, I totally respect that from day one, but I don't respect that 4 years later when you have dossiers and dossiers and entire walls full of evidence to still be thinking, well, were they fair? I'm like, by this point, like, if we're still having this debate, we might as well not air the story, So there was, to be honest with you, I think it comes from different things we're trying to achieve with the story. I think that's what it comes from.
That's great.
I think I just want to jump in a little bit and say Hamza is really bringing a good topic here, where reporters of color are viewed as not, they are not held as same standard as their white peers. And when you are covering race or national security and all that, you are being labeled as kind of an activist and not objective, whatever that term means. And it's something that a lot of journalists of color really deal every single day when they are in New York Times or Washington Post or everywhere else. So it's not, you get exposed to that quite early on, but it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to when you're covering issues that are really close to your heart.
Yeah, you have to meet a higher bar. There's a reason I sought tons of documents from the government when I investigated civilian casualties. Sometimes it's not enough to do the reporting that's required. You have to go above and beyond because of those perceptions, and that can be quite unfair. I want to ask if there's questions, especially for Mukhtar or for Anna. I see somebody back there.
Yeah, hello, hi. My name's Rosina Breen. I'm the Editor-in-Chief and CEO at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism based in London, so British media, for which I'm not sure whether to apologise or not. A couple of observations or comments, and then a question really for you, Hamza. The first is I was a network editor and a local editor during the Trojan horse affair in Birmingham, but also Bradford had its own version. So actually I've seen quite a lot of good nuanced reporting on that, but nevertheless it's interesting around where we might lean into in terms of social cohesion around race. And also just to point out that I'm a Muslim woman editor. I probably have a slightly more nuanced view around what happened in Birmingham. So, we tell many different stories. But my question for you specifically is around which is the best platform for the story? So in this case, it's the New York Times, which is an international outfit telling a story about a deeply local issue that probably resonates around the UK and around the world. And whether you had wished that investigation, your investigation, had been told on a platform within the UK or within local media, the Birmingham Mail, for example, or BBC Sound. So, you had a great story, but how did you want it to resonate with a very kind of multifaceted community?
No, I think it's a good question. It's something I've been thinking about since the podcast came out, because when I said, I don't know, about an hour ago, whatever, when I said that I had only heard 2 podcasts before I made one, it's reflecting that a podcast is not big where I'm from. You know what I mean? There's not a big culture of podcast listeners in Birmingham, and I still don't have a clear idea of how many people in East Birmingham proper have heard the Trojan horse affair, because that's not how they consume news. And I've gone around in a couple of talks since then. I've mentioned this as a point that, like, from here on, listen, I had a choice of you either do this as a student project with a professor who's not really keen on it, or you go do it with Brian Reed and, at that stage, maybe Serial. So given that choice, I'm sure most people would pick Serial there, and do something with it. But now, whatever story, if I'm going to do a story again, like, there has to be some reflection on how do the people who the story's about, how do they consume their news? And prioritizing that as the thing that you do, everything else comes after that. Like, we were precious because of how long we'd spent on this to release this as this big podcast series, and you kind of take it all in, and you appreciate the whole kind of breadth and scale of the investigation. But in reality, we could have released an article to accompany this. And I think we've had conversations with the New York Times since that they might do that, because you could distill the actual like kind of critical findings, put it in a local paper or whatever affiliated paper you want to go with, in order for people not to have to listen to an 8-hour thing to kind of glean all the details that you want them to pay attention to. So I feel like I didn't have a choice than to go with the thing that I did. But going forward, I think it's important to remember that, like, whoever these stories are about, they get first dibs on how, how you tell it, how you put it out there. And if they're getting their news from YouTube, then you do a YouTube thing. If they're getting their news from TikTok, you do a TikTok thing. Whatever means that they get access to it first, and then the world can listen to it. Because in reality, the Trojan horse was a story for everyone else around the world, but it was a piece of journalism for a very specific community in England. And it did very little, quite frankly, for that community in Birmingham. Like, it hasn't benefited them in any sense whatsoever. But it's have me here speaking to you guys in Berkeley, you know what I mean? So, like, the story did well, but the journalism failed. And so I think that's, I have to reflect on that in terms of the choices made and the way we told the story.
Great. Other questions? Let's go with the very back. Or no, I'm sorry, somebody was pointing where? Yes. Okay, the other side of the room.
I have a question for Mukhtar and Anna. After you do these excellent stories exposing corruption in government, do you think there is a way we can use journalism maybe in a follow-up story to guide or to have a response that leads to actions to improve the performance of government rather than just being disillusioned and tuning out? Might it be stories that look at systemic causes versus only the actions of individuals or things like that? It's something I struggle with a lot. Like, after the story, if you mentioned the conservatives liking your coverage, does it just become, well, all government's fraudulent, so we shouldn't invest in it?
That's a great question. One piece that we did comes to mind where we broke down like specific things that we could have done with the money that was spent on these, pet projects. So, like, $5 million for the volleyball stadium could provide childcare to this many thousands of families, which I think helped people understand what the missed opportunity was, and like maybe gave some, idea of like what we should be prioritizing instead. Now I'm in Mississippi, and it's really hard to get traction there with the people in charge. There have been hearings that state Democrats have held to talk about solutions and, where we should be putting our priority instead. But I would say right now, we've addressed the fraud issue in that we've like tightened up our subgranting processes and the process by which an organization gets a grant. But we in turn have left $100 million just sitting on the table. So instead of spending that money, in ways that could help people by rooting out the fraud, we were just not spending it at all. I do think, though, that like as the feds come in and the federal government is going to come, down on Mississippi at some point, and I realize that that's just about this one story, but I think that they have to do something. They have to change their ways in some way. So I think that we will see that eventually.
In our case, we looked at what the state government could have done differently. This was at the height of the pandemic around 2020, and the government loosened, restrictions around the reporting and supervision and everything else around distributing food in the communities. And when actually the state found out about, the fraud, they stopped, accepting applications, and then the sponsor organizations sued, and the Supreme Court agreed with it. But I think, I wonder if there could have been something that would have prevented this widespread fraud. And now I think the state is trying to pass some bills around asking nonprofits if they are trying to get any contracts from the government to provide at least 3 years of budget and their audited 990s and a list of their board members and all that. And I think that could probably help make sure there won't be another round of fraud.
I know that there's more questions. I have more questions. I would encourage you to ask all of them during lunch, but I want to give everybody a huge round of applause. That was extraordinary.
Logan Symposium attendees may notice that we have tweaked the name of that last panel, which no longer has an association with sausage. But we hope that even with the rebranding, it's a panel that offers some really fascinating behind-the-scenes look at some of the year's best investigations. So hello, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Bernice Yeung, and I'm the managing editor of the Investigative Reporting Program, and I'm going to be your guide. Before we continue, I just have a couple quick logistical notes. First, I wanted to point out that the restrooms are behind the registration tables and on the basement level. There's a lactation room in the building next door. Shout out to all the journalists who've had to pump in the back